Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching today's long-range U.S.-focused forecast video brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. This analysis is being provided for perspective only, and any decision made based upon this presentation is the sole responsibility of the person making the decision. Finally, please remember that all long-range weather forecasting is speculative by nature. Well, I thought we'd start here by just taking a look at what May has given us to give us, well, across much of the United States, an extremely wet May. But it's not only across the U.S. where we've had a lot of very interesting weather. Let me talk about the major features here. That map that you see over there on the right, we're looking right down on top of the North Pole. And you're looking at anomalies of the 500 millibar flow. Basically, the blues mean troughs, and the warmer colors there represent ridges. Now, I kind of made a list over here of all the things that have dominated our flow pattern, but let me just kind of show you a couple of very important things. Do you see this elongated trough that's stretching in through here and the ridge that's to its south? That particular pattern gives us a very, very powerful jet stream across the Pacific. We've talked about that a lot in our updates. That Pacific branch of the jet stream is hitting the western United States and dipping south before turning right back into the Central Plains. And it's doing that because we've overall favored a ridge sitting over the southeast in the lower levels of the atmosphere. Now, that same flow pattern is being aided by the fact that across much of the North Pole region, so right in through here, you can see that we have, in general, ridging going on. And because of that, that's just allowing the whole atmosphere to gain momentum. It's gaining speed. We have a strong gradient in both pressure and temperature, and it gets going fast. Now look at what it does as we go across the Atlantic, because I want you to see how this all kind of daisy chains together here. This broader trough here builds into a ridge just off the west coast of Europe, and then it plunges into a trough here and lifts again. Now this is why we've seen a lot of reports of Central Europe being cool over much of the month of May, whereas Eastern Europe and the Russian wheat belt have been warm. We've been building into a ridge over that area. We've also seen recently some very heavy precip inside of this trough that you see sitting here. What happens, we get across Russia, there's a ridge here, but it dives into another trough here around Mongolia, and then lifts again here as we get over into this part of China. So China is right over here, and this is China's main productive area. Now, the reason why I talk about this is because this is the flow pattern that if we don't break this down, we continue to stay extremely wet, not only through the end of May, but through the beginning of June as well. Some other global things are helping with this. Of course, we have the El Nino event that's going on. It's a weak one, but it's there. We've had some anomalously stronger westerly wind bursts, as we call them. The Madden-Julian oscillation, I'll just say this, it's not working against the pattern. In other words, the MJO is not shutting things down. We got a warm Pacific and we have a warm Western Atlantic, and those two things are helping the whole flow pattern move. So I want to show you something new that I'm creating here. And what this is a high-resolution view of the last 30 days of precipitation anomalies. And I want you to see what was going on. Remember, the strong Pacific jet was diving like this and then lifting. And because of that, we had this region very, very wet. What do we talk about with Europe? Well, Europe kind of goes a little bit off the map here, but remember, we had this trough that developed like this and then lifted, and as a result, it was wet in through here. Then there was a ridge into this area that dove into a trough like this and lifted, and now we're wet over here. That global pattern is keeping much of the northern hemisphere's most productive ground. So I'm talking about the United States here, I'm talking about Europe and north of the Black Sea, as well as those regions there in northern China, very wet. And as a consequence, our wet spring across much of the globe has kind of been the name of the game. But some locations have been much, much, much wetter than others. And specifically, I'm talking about the central United States. Now, really quickly, I want to show you, I know you're looking down here at South America. Oh, look at the red showing up there. Are they having any problems? Well, remember, they're at the very tail end of their growing season here. And so the thing is that the safrinha crop, this is the time of year where they're beginning to harvest in Brazil, and they want it to dry down. And where it's been wetter, where the season is a little bit longer down here in southern Brazil, well, this is favoring things. So Brazil doesn't have a negative story at this point. But take a look, let's go right back here into the central U.S. Because of that, we know that now 2019 is the slowest planting progress we've had for corn since 1990. And the big question we got to discuss in this video is, do we maintain this current trajectory such that by the time we get to week 21, maybe we're sitting at 70-75% planted, which would be something in through this vicinity, or is something going to continue to slow us down and keep the trajectory of our planting progress even slower than we saw in the last week? We're going to talk about that in quite a bit of detail and then stretch this out a little longer. We certainly know that the last several days has been incredibly wet from the west coast all the way into the central plains. I talked in my west coast video yesterday about some of the damage we did to the cherry crop that was about ready to be harvested here in parts of the Sacramento Valley and the San Joaquin Valley. Well, this onshore flow has been good for some and bad for others, and one place it's been very bad for is this region running through here. In addition to a lot of severe weather that has extended in that area, in fact even points to the east of here as well, you can see if I get rid of my drawings that some parts of Kansas and Oklahoma and Missouri have picked up greater than 6 inches, and some locations in there pushing a foot of rain just out of the last few systems. Just looking over the bigger picture here over the last 30 days, we can see here the percent of normal rainfall, and there are very few places across the country that have been drier. Where we've been drier, though, a lot of progress has been made in some of those locations, but overall, this has been one of the wettest springs on record, and it follows one of the wettest fall and harvest time periods on record. I'm sorry, the wettest harvest time period on record for the middle part of the country. So we expect to see more of this. This is our USGS river gauge map, and it's got right now 581 gauges that are near or above flood stage. And basically the problems you see here aren't going away anytime soon. You know, my mom always taught me, if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. And I can imagine a lot of farmers that are in the mid part of the country would kind of wish we meteorologists would shut up, because we just keep showing you maps like this. This was this morning's model runs put together by the National Blended Model, and you can clearly see here the wet biases continuing, especially for parts of the western Corn Belt over the next 10 days. Large dominant ridge over the southeast. We're going to scorch this area over the coming days. Temperatures getting deep into the 90s. Some records for May are at risk of falling underneath that ridge. But overall, that ridge is just keeping the flow pattern like this. We've got plenty of Gulf moisture. And because of the trough that sits here, like we talked about at the beginning, this is the area that just continues to get more and more precipitation. Just to show you the latest operational model runs from the European model over here on the left, we can just see the dominance of that southeast ridge. See the giant donut hole here? And what do we get? We just get flow that comes into this area, and that's where we're packing in over the next 10 days. A pretty wide stretch in there of getting at least another 2 inches plus of rainfall. Some locally heavier amounts are possible. Like we just saw, we have the potential, because there's just enough moisture to have some places getting 4, 5, and 6 inches of rain. One of the interesting details about this is that this has expanded across the eastern Corn Belt. Remember, that's a region I've been saying it's been difficult to forecast what the rain's going to look like in that area, but certainly over the next 10 days, both the European model and the GFS are favoring even wetter conditions in that area. Putting it all together for the next 15 days, we can just see the flow pattern telegraphed here in our precipitation anomaly maps. So we have on the right the GFS ensemble, and on the left we have the European ensemble. And as I've been saying, they've been in lockstep with one another. Places that will be dry, it looks as though parts of the Pacific Northwest will be favoring a little bit drier pattern. Certainly the southeast, extremely hot and dry. And the Canadian prairies are also picking up on a bit of a drier pattern here. So maybe we'll get some field work done in that region. But certainly in the central United States and in parts of the Midwest and most of the Corn Belt, we're favoring a wetter than average pattern moving forward over the next 15 days. In addition to that, it's been quite cold on the backsides of these systems. We've been talking about the high plains snow threat, and today we have frost advisories and freeze warnings for this part of Colorado. In fact, this picture was snapped by the Colorado Rockies, and they tweeted it out, and they said everything's fine. Yeah, they got snow on their field here in Denver. So this is the pattern we've been in, and that snow, just look at the last 72 hours of total accumulated precipitation. We're breaking some May records here in the high plains with snowfall amounts in some locations getting well above 6 to 8 inches, which is just, well, nobody wants to see this kind of stuff this time of year. I mean, it's the end of May. We're a month away from the summer solstice, and yet we're still seeing this pattern set up. So what are we looking at over the next 5 days? That's the map on the left. We continue with the cold bias here and the warm bias here, and that's just That's just the flow of the atmosphere for you. You see here day 6 through 10, we're going to just continue to scorch the parts of the East Coast, especially down in the southeast, setting records, and we hang on to our cooler bias here. The flow pattern does try to do something a little bit more elongated, which is why we bring in this high over low pattern, which could warm up the northwest with time, and they need it. They need to get that heat back in there for a lot of the crops that are grown in the northwest. They need that early accumulation of growing degree day units. Speaking of which, we can see that it's the southeast that is extremely ahead of normal in terms of their progress of the accumulation of growing degree day units, whereas we've been in deficit here. A lot of cloud cover and cooler temperatures. That's also the story down in Texas. A lot of cloud cover preventing much of the heat because of the position of that trough too. Look at this. Look at normally. I mean, my goodness, it's almost June. We start to see a lot of triple-digit days down here in the southwest, but we're just not getting them with this pattern. So what about days 11 through 15? This is where things get tough. They get really difficult to forecast, and my long-range forecast confidence right now is not too high. You can see things tend to wash out. We tend to lose a lot of our anomalies here once we get into the beginning of June, and we got to talk about why that is. So let's start off first. This is what the pattern is going to look like through day 5. We just continue to have our deep southwestern United States or west coast trough, dominant ridge over the southeast, and this just keeps pumping in that moisture. So I'm broken record here. I've been telling you this for weeks now. What do I see by day 10? Well, this is the transition I'm trying to pick up on, okay? We see that the flow pattern is attempting to do this. It may even come back around for high over low. But then our big trough that was sitting over, the big ridge sitting over the southeast tends to be kind of flattening out here. And that's because we have a much more dominant trough feature extending from the Hudson Bay through the Great Lakes. And this is a bit of a pattern change. Now we still have our high latitude blocking here, okay? And you may look at this and say, well, Snodgrass, what do we need if we want to just warm up, get this crop planted, get this pattern out of here? Well, I'll take those drawings off and I'll show you what you need. Or maybe what I'll do is I'll just change colors. Let's just go over to a blue color here. You want this to be the flow of the atmosphere. You want a big ridge stuck in here. And we don't have that, at least through day 10. Question is, do we get that by the time we get out to day 15? Now, there are some subtle differences that will change things for us, but we got to make sure we understand what they mean. First, you see the anomalously higher heights here and lower heights there, okay? That is a flip-flop of the pattern we saw over the Pacific recently, which just means that this is going to slow down the Pacific jet, which we want. But it appears that overall it's going to split. Part of it's going to go north into Canada here, and another part of it's going to keep going south. Now, what we don't have in the 15-day forecast time period is if you look in general, the height lines kind of dip through here. Now, that is different because normally we've been seeing, but recently we've been seeing a big ridge over that area I just kind of colored in. Now, instead, the flow pattern's a bit more subtle and that ridge is elongated down here. And we've seen heights increasing in this area, not necessarily over Greenland. Okay, so it's a change. The question is, does this change mean we are going to dry out? Well, I'm starting to get some signals that we will at least not be as wet as we have been once we get past week 2. Showing you only week 2, at least the precipitation anomalies here are not as extreme as they were. It still looks wet because as that ridge slides into this area, we still have flow like this. It's just not as amplified. And because there's already a lot of moisture in the ground, we're going to recycle that, which means we're going to continue to have abundant amount of moisture for any system to kind of use to make things wet. Now, I showed you this last week, but it's important to see again. If we have any chance of drying out, we need this. See the trough here? See the trough there. We got to have our 3 bullseyes here. We got to have one big ridge forming in the Aleutian Islands, one large ridge forming in the central United States, and a big one south of Greenland. We get rid of our high latitude blocking with ridging over Greenland as well. So we need this kind of like trifecta here of ridges. That's what our hottest and driest Junes give us. So we have to work toward that if we're going to dry out. Now, what do we see? Well, we see some of the ingredients, but not the right ones, okay? Certainly, the Pacific jet stream will slow down some. will slow down some. It's still going to be fast, but not nearly as fast. This, by the way, is for the week of June 7th through the 14th. What do we end up getting? Well, we do start to raise the heights here. That's one of our 3 ridges. And we do see some bowing of the height lines in this area. But in reality, there's so many different model runs. There's 51 that go into this that we've kind of washed a few things out. You see, I still have this kind of split flow pattern out west. And our ridge, which is kind of sitting over here, isn't the dominant ridge that races up the middle part of the country like you just saw. So because of that, the model is being consistent with itself, and it's trying to keep this region on a slight cool bias, whereas it's going to be warm kind of in this region over here. And because of that cooler bias and because of the ridge sitting down here in this region, look at the map in the bottom left, we might end up setting ourselves up with still a wetter pattern that comes out of the southwest like this, at least as we move forward. Now, these anomalies are not huge, okay, and there's a lot of uncertainty in this pattern through through mid-June, but still, it's not the super dry pattern that we want to see. And then I take you all the way out here to June 21st, and the Pacific Ocean has gone back into a bit of a faster pace, and we tend to still see these height lines diving over here. And as a consequence, this isn't the shutdown we would want to see with a big ridge in here. It's just not high enough amplitude at this point. Certainly this is favorable. I like to see this, but this ridge over here is just not dominant. So our pattern doesn't go over, at least by the long-range European forecast, into the best configuration to get hotter and drier in June. So you can see that the longer range prognosis here from the European model, look down there in the bottom right, still kind of keeps that region wet. A big change that's interesting to see as you get into June is also the models are keeping much of the East Coast wet too. Drier in the Canadian prairies, drier in the north central United States by this model run, but that's kind of the bigger picture we're looking at. Is there multi-model support? Well, I'm going to show you the CFS V2. This is the US long-range model here run by the CPC. Interesting look here moving forward. I want to go straight to week number 4 and just look at this pattern. You can see that there are some similarities. We certainly have the trough that's sitting here in this ridge that's trying to form in this area, but I think we're going to be getting, again, some split flow here, and you can see that it's also trying to keep a section of the country wet. The CFS V2 has been the underperformer of our models, which is why I focus much more on the European model, but I at least wanted to show you what it said. So I want to bring you to these conclusions, okay? Top list of stuff here. What could go wrong and keep us in this current pattern? Let's imagine that the models didn't pick up properly on the slowdown of the Pacific and it stays strong. If that southeast ridge doesn't flatten and it actually gets stronger and that high or low pattern returns in the west, we just keep getting these four corners troughs that come out. And if that Greenland ridge comes back, all of that just means June's going to continue to be wet. Now, if it breaks down, okay, if it breaks down and we do start to see better ridging in the middle part of the country, remember, we've got a lot of moisture still in our topsoil, which can be recycled, and with northwest flow aloft, that means the flow pattern may be, I'm just going to draw on this map, but I want you to see it. That means the flow pattern is doing something more like this. We still get a lot of shower and thunderstorm activity across the Corn Belt moving forward, but it's more hit or miss. So that could be maybe a mid to late June transition we're going to have to look out for. What has to happen to get the central part of the United States and the Midwest dry? I need a Gulf of Alaska trough, a deep one. I need a ridge axis that's going to go from Texas to North Dakota, and I also need the North Atlantic to build into a ridge as well. And we kind of saw hints at that, but just not the dominant flow we would need. We'd also have to really dry out the topsoil, because right now that moisture sitting in the topsoil can be evaporated and used, as this crop is trying to emerge, can be used to make more thunderstorms. And I got to get the ocean temperatures off the west coast to cool. We've talked about that a lot in recent updates. There's just not a broad area of cooler water there. So some big questions I'm going to have to be answering over the coming weeks and even months is, does summer still look to favor a cool, wet pattern? Well, I've been showing you the long-range European model, and I've showed you the NMME. I'm going to show you some research done at the University of Columbia here. And what we're getting here is their IRI multi-model probability forecasts for June, July, August. Now, this is interesting. You can see that they're not favoring hot or dry, Corn Belt this upcoming summer. They actually have things looking very, very wet right in through this area and possibly a southeastern ridge. Now, long-range forecasting like this is incredibly difficult, but they apply some statistical modeling to the long-range dynamical models to give you this forecast. Almost everything right now is leaning toward a cooler and wetter summer, but I'm just not fully convinced on this just yet. We're going to have to watch very carefully for what might happen over the southeastern United States. If we continue to favor a ridge in that area, it's going to be it'll be the litmus test. It'll be the thing we'll have to watch carefully over the coming days to see how, and weeks to see how the pattern sets up. And just let you know, tomorrow National Hurricane Center releases their seasonal prediction for hurricanes. More than likely, they will be calling for a near average to having a greater bias toward a below average hurricane season. And that will simply be due to the position of El Nino and stronger wind shear over the Atlantic. But remember, it only takes one system, and we'll be analyzing that forecast in our next long range update. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this forecast video up here. We at Nutrien Ag Solutions hope you look forward to our next long-range forecast discussion that come out every Wednesday midday. Hope you have a great week, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.